I think like one of the kind of unhelpful things that has occurred in like these like last 8 years or so, 7 or 8 years, I think has been taking as a given that there's rural-urban divide, or saying the words rural-urban divide without asking a little bit more deeply, what's the water that is beneath that bedrock?
Hello, and welcome to Art Restart, where we learn from artists who, wherever they work, whatever they make, are shaking up the status quo in their fields and in their communities. I'm Piercarlo Talenti, the producer and editor of this podcast, which is brought to you by the Thomas S. Keenan Institute for the Arts at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. In this episode, we'll be speaking with Matthew Fluharty, the founder and executive director of Art of the Rural. Initially created as a blog in 2010, Art of the Rural is now a thriving organization that works to support and promote the work of artists and culture bearers in often overlooked sections of the country. Through that work, Art of the Rural also strives to bridge cultural and geographic divides that, in fact, may not be as pronounced as we've been led to believe. Matthew has a lot more to say about that. Since its founding, Art of the Rural, which is headquartered in Winona, Minnesota, has developed several long-term projects in collaboration with artists and community leaders, particularly in the upper Midwest, as well as in Kentucky Appalachia. Projects have included High Visibility, On Location in Rural American and Indian Country, which was a collaboration with the Plains Art Museum in Fargo, North Dakota. It was the first major museum exhibition highlighting contemporary art practice across these geographies. Art of the Rural also has 2 cultural exchange programs, the Kentucky Rural-Urban Exchange and the Minnesota Rural-Urban Exchange. You'll hear Matthew refer to them as RUCs for short, that have afforded scores of artists a chance to immerse themselves meaningfully in settings once unfamiliar to them. Matthew spoke to me from his home in Winona. I started off by asking him how he took Art of the Rural from a blog to a full-fledged, full-time nonprofit organization.
Yeah, it was a challenging process, I have to say. You have to keep in mind, so like I was starting Art of the Rural while finishing a dissertation, and I defended that in 2013, and really had the good fortune of being a research fellow in American Studies and then in the art school at WashU. So I had a period where I could kind of think through these questions and do work, but it was clear that there was sort of like a fork in the road, and I had to kind of take a leap.
And what was the fork? Was it between entering the academy and doing something else, or what was it?
It was, yeah. So it was between entering the academy or just pursuing this vision with Art of the Rural. And I think increasingly I don't see them as mutually exclusive. Though at the time I also had a young family. I knew there was only so much that I could achieve in either mission. And so we incorporated in 2014.
But that's important to note that having a family, you were also concerned about income.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like, honestly, I think this is left out of the arts conversation sometimes.
No, I know, which is why I'm happy to talk about it.
But like what I should say as well is I don't see being in the academy and being involved in an arts nonprofit or doing creative work as binaries at all, because in many respects, my advisors at WashU were very, very enthusiastic about the blog at a moment when now all academics have blogs. But at that point, I was a real anomaly for having a blog, and that's a whole nother story. But what I would say maybe more concisely is that my advisors were very supportive of Art of the Rural as a concept, as a vehicle for writing and thinking and connection. And through them, they connected me to the School of Entrepreneurship at WashU, which ended up being this is such an overused term, but really a game changer for the future of Art of the Rural, in terms of just thinking about how to craft a mission statement, how to share it in front of an audience, how to think about, a lot of organizational and leadership elements that are certainly not taught in a humanities degree program. I credit the School of Entrepreneurship at WashU really deeply for the journey that began to unfold. And to maybe kind of like compact down a much longer story about this period, I was really grateful that, Art of the Rural at that stage, it did portend certain academic work, and like there were really kind offers from a couple schools for Art of the Rural, essentially to sort of, for me to travel with Art of the Rural to those environments. But within that same time, like we had built just like a number of networks around the country and really received some positive encouragement, mentorship from a number of foundations that, there's a runway here for this program to exist and to make useful impacts in the arts field. And it was really those encouragements that led to going in that direction and founding the nonprofit. We received our first grant from the National Endowment for the Arts then in 2015. And then that kind of coincided with a move out of St. Louis and further upriver to Winona, Minnesota.
I'd love it if, just so we can get a sense of the scope of your work. In the introduction, of course, I explain what Art of the Rural is, but it's hard to encompass all that you do in a simple introduction. So I wonder if you can talk about one project and describe what it researches, what it attempts to do, who's involved. I wonder if you can walk us through one project in particular.
So many examples come to mind, but just thinking about just like the gorgeous artistic and cultural continuum of the Upper Mississippi, I really think about the Spillway Initiative that in various shapes and forms, Art of the Rural has been collaborating with folks on really for 10 years at this point. All of our initiatives are very long-term, very patient, very long-term. But the Spillway work really was one of the bridges towards sort of our journey further north to Winona, Minnesota, and to Dakota homelands, in that it began in St. Louis and East St. Louis in this region called the American Bottom, which until the Louisiana Purchase was called such because it was the floodplains, at the end of it, at that point, what was the contiguous United States of America. And it's a 60-mile long floodplain. And I just had the tremendous luck of collaborating with Jesse Vogler, who's an amazing landscape architect, Jen Colton, who is an extraordinary photographer. And this was in this kind of period where I was really trying to think out what the next step was for my career and for Art of the Rural. And sort of running downstream next to that was this deeply, deeply immersive work looking at a region that, for the most part, is unacknowledged as a region. This floodplain that extends from Alton, Illinois, down to about 40 miles south of St. Louis. East St. Louis is in the middle of it, which is its own sort of like a racial challenge for the mindset of the Midwest. And though there were a lot of like really heavy things and heavy choices in that period, that work led to a regional newspaper called the American Bottom Gazette. It led to thinking through like how to exhibit artwork and sort of like cultural and landscape-based research in sites that might seem really unconventional to the arts world, like exhibitions that are in job site trailers in the small towns of the American Bottom and the industrial towns of the American Bottom. And it just led to sort of, because we knew from the start it was long-term, just the process of building deep relationship with folks, everyone from county historical societies to community organizers, to folks running restaurants, to artists. And that ethic and that commitment to the story being long and it needing, years and years and years, kind of led to our overall strategy with the Spillway effort, which looks at the Upper Mississippi and really seeks to support artists and culture bearers and the local organizations that support them. And to do so primarily through fellowships, which are themselves long-term. They're 18-month fellowships that don't begin with like a quote-unquote deliverable named. It's support for these individuals to work with organizations, to have the time to kind of assess like what work matters, what cultural stories have not been heard, what hasn't been seen, what relationships could be built with some material support as a foundation. And I think in our own way, the American Bottom work was our own kind of self-funded fellowship in that way. And at this point, these spillway fellowships have supported really incredible individuals, folks like Faye Dant in Hannibal, Missouri, who is a Black culture bearer, who out of the fellowship and out of her founding and direction and leadership with Jim's Journey, the Huck Finn Freedom Center there in Hannibal, has created a book called Hannibal's Invisibles, which is the first. It's amazing to think this way. It is the first book about Black history and lived experience in Hannibal, Missouri, which is the birthplace of Mark Twain, for which there's a whole tourism industry and a publishing industry and so many things. From that kind of work to further, like closer to home up here, work supporting really deep intercultural exchange between Dakota artists and their communities, but also between the white settler communities up here as well. I think like the common like prismatic light between this, it's about land and culture and history, and about, honoring one's own inheritance and their life, but also honoring cultural difference and like really leaning into how do we share these stories with various audiences such that like we can build relationship.
What stories that have come out of Spillway would you never have learned were it not for Spillway?
Ooh. I think what comes to mind when I think about this question and Spillway, the support and Art of the Rural as an organization, like what we're seeking, first and foremost, is to support artists and culture bearers and those local organizations that they work with. But what I think has been just so profound and beautiful, to use one example, is like how that seed germinates deeper regional and community relationship and connection. And the example that I would use would be Spillway's fellowship support of Honoring Dakota, which is an absolutely extraordinary intercultural organization that's works in collaboration with Red Wing Arts. Red Wing is a city maybe about an hour south of the Twin Cities. Red Wing is also really close to Prairie Island Indian community, a Dakota community. And Honoring Dakota is an organization that seeks through intercultural exchange to elevate visibility, storytelling, right relationship, and healing for that region, for the broader region that I find myself in here in Winona. And it's really been one of the most profound experiences of my time with Art of the Rural to experience how Honoring Dakota and members of Prairie Island Indian community have not only created work and furthered their own practice and their own relationships, but how that work has really expanded connection and knowledge and right relationship with the community here in Winona. I mean, I can safely say that I think without the Spillway Fellowship, those effects would have happened, but they would not have happened in such a concentrated way across the course of 18 months. I mean, this is the power of artistic and cultural work, and that like in and of itself, it has such depths, but it also has the ability to move social understanding, and I think even to move sort of civic policy-based outcomes. I mean, that's always also one of our hopes with our work at Art of the Rural is that over the long term, some of those elements can also occur. Winona is a town that is named after the Dakota word for firstborn daughter. And, it's not unique in terms of being a small micropolitan city, in a rural county, like so many others where, there are words for things, but not the relationships that go with them, and there are words for things, but sometimes not a deeper investigation as people or as a community around what that means and for whom we're responsible. And it's just been just like one of the true gifts of my time in Art of the Rural to witness how the beginning of relationship with Honoring Dakota and with members of Prairie Island Indian community has, I think, really portended really deep and beautiful and responsible change in this community over the long term.
Speaking of social understanding, I'd love to learn more about the rural-urban exchange that you've been running for a while now. What kinds of misunderstandings do you think such exchanges are correcting, and what kinds of understandings are they fostering?
What I would say we have found through that work in Kentucky, so in 10 years, it's about 300 folks have gone through the program. It's reached 65 counties. We've had community cohort, really intensive, deep intercultural community cohorts in 16 different places across Kentucky. Out of that, like really long work, I think what we have found is that the questions that we need to ask might be different than the ones that are being asked.
Oh.
And I think like one of the kind of unhelpful things that has occurred in like these like last 8 years or so, 7 or 8 years, I think has been taking as a given that there's rural-urban divide, or saying the words rural-urban divide without asking a little bit more deeply, what's the water that is beneath that bedrock? Because it surely can't. I mean, like, because so many times we say that, and like I think especially in the press, it's a shorthand for saying like Republican and Democrat or something like that.
And also, in a way, white versus people of color, whereas, in fact, as we all know, there's plenty of people of color in rural settings. But yes, there's a lot of coded language, and politicians and the media are amplifying these misunderstandings because it gets a lot of people talking, I think.
Yeah, and when folks come together across Kentucky, or more recently in the last 4 years here in Minnesota, across rural, urban, and native nations up here, what you find is like those binaries really only serve the people in power. And they're oftentimes, those aren't like kind of the animating forces of everyday community life or life in a county or a region of a state. And what I think has emerged like really powerfully in Kentucky and in Minnesota, like, is that the heart of this work is intercultural. It's not necessarily about politics. Politics is a part of people's lives, but it's about everyday experience. It's about people's personal history, their family history, where they grew up, where they came from. And I think sometimes, I've been really grateful the degree to which this program has been covered in the press, but sometimes it's too easy to cast this as they're bringing people together across political difference. That would be such shallow work if that was the mission of the Rural Urban Exchange. It's about folks who maybe grew up in Louisville having a chance to go to the Eastern Kentucky coal fields. And say you're a community organizer in Louisville, you meet someone who's doing that work in Eastern Kentucky. Or you're a folklorist in Eastern Kentucky and you meet somebody doing folklore work in Western Kentucky. What it really has done for the individuals involved, I think really powerfully in Kentucky, has been kind of like truly like a living organism all to itself, which is built. I think we say words like relationship and connection sometimes as if they're words that we can just kind of like color in whenever we want, almost like they're disposable words. But like what has happened in Kentucky has been like real connection, and like organizations and programs and collaborations have, come out of this work alongside just like folks meeting each other's families, camping together, having meals together. And, I think in the arts field, sometimes there can be I understand it as a necessity to kind of, measure things and make metrics. But how do you measure the vitality and like the beautiful cultural difference of a network? It just has to say it itself. And that's really what Kentucky Rux has done at this point. It's hundreds of folks who really are an ecosystem all to themselves. You really couldn't, you'd be hard pressed to kind of encapsulate what all of that work has done or meant or is doing. That's a community. It's a legit community.
Okay, now is the time when we talk about structural change. You must have some ideas, now that you've done the work as long as you have, of ways in which rural artists could be supported much better than they are currently.
So many. Yeah. I think so. Let me try to articulate this through a couple different vistas of scale.
Okay.
If one of the goals is to think about this work as a field, we need institutions to come along with us. We need institutions to take chances. We need institutions to do the things that institutions do to bring people together, to catalyze conversations, to welcome in researchers and scholars and folks thinking across disciplines, to welcome those folks around the questions that artists and culture bearers are raising through their work. I think that just would be like such an electric moment for all of us, if that begins to occur in any kind of way. So I think there's that. I would say, as well, as if we move beyond that element of scale towards, like, let's just think regionally. What's really exciting that is happening is acknowledging that just like the way that folks regionally receive information, like, has really shifted in the last 10 years. So I think one of the really important structural things that could occur, like, which is occurring, is for institutions and funders to really support different forms of commentary, different forms of reporting, different forms of news that are, like, really responsible regionally. And I would really, like, raise up a magazine like The New Territory, which is working in the lower Midwest, a news institution like the Flatwater Press in Nebraska. These are things which exist in kind of regional news deserts for, like, really deep cultural writing. But these are also the avenues through which the artists doing some of the most, like, profound and provocative work can be seen, and can be written about by writers who may more innately understand what's at stake in that work. So, like, I think there is kind of a media element to this. One of my, like, bizarre sort of side curatorial projects has been this archive, deeply influenced by Ann Kawara, of archiving print photojournalism about rural places each day in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, alongside a bunch of other rural newspapers that I intersect with. What I think we see really broadly with the New York Times, which is an extraordinary newspaper, is that oftentimes, like, rural is represented, let me say rural and Indian country in this regard, are represented as a political commodity. And there's often far less coverage of the artistic and cultural emanations from those places. And really, without places like the Journal or the Times or a couple other large-scale, excellent news organizations changing that approach, how will we not see these places as kind of like hollow political cutouts? I think that's part of it. But I think, like, the structural change that, like, absolutely must occur is American foundations equitably supporting artists and communities in non-urban space. Like, there's no way this doesn't happen without some reckoning. And
do you see that starting to change?
Yeah, I do. And I think I would point to Minnesota, and it works really in both ways. So, like, Minnesota, I think, as you probably know, has really strong public support for arts and culture through a state amendment that is maybe at this point about 10 years old, that was a partnership between arts and cultural organizations, history organizations, outdoor recreation, and hunting and conservation groups. Like, these groups that we would not necessarily think would be collaborators, but they all have benefited, like, to the tune of, at this point, close to $1 billion in support for their various programs. And so what that looks like in the arts part of that conversation is every region of Minnesota, if you're an artist, you can get a grant. And there are networks and support structures for folks to come together, and we have extraordinarily supportive and equitable foundations here, like McKnight, like Jerome, like many others. And I'm kind of, like, backing into your question to some degree, because I think in Minnesota, we have a philanthropic structure which is supportive. We have a state program which has really raised the prospects for artists, but also, like, for artists in relation to history and heritage and conservation. If you live in a rural area, those aren't contradictions. You know what I mean? Those definitely not contradictions. But, like, you cross the river into Wisconsin, which is, like, it's just a mile from where I'm standing right now. Here in Minnesota, it's $7 per person funding for the arts. In Wisconsin, it's 70 cents. So how does an entire ecosystem change just by that, let alone the philanthropic changes that would be in Wisconsin or in Iowa or in North Dakota or South Dakota? How does that philanthropic change also impact Native nations and communities in these regions that we're talking about? How does it impact the prospects for intercultural collaboration and exchange? So I feel like Minnesota is, I think, a really useful example for what this could look like nationally.
You can read a longer version of this interview in which Matthew discusses the relationship of his art to his Zen Buddhism practice at uncsa.edu/artrestart. Is there a pressing issue facing artists that you'd like us to explore further in the podcast? Maybe a status quo you'd like to see tossed out the window? I would love to hear from you. I bet I can interview the right artist to address your concern. You can find me on Instagram at Piercarlo Talenti, with Pierre spelled P-I-E-R. It's Italian. Our theme music is by Shanghai Restoration Project. I'm Piercarlo Talenti, and on behalf of the Keenan Institute for the Arts at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts, thank you for listening.